Great. Okay, so welcome everyone. My name is Aaron O'Day, and it's an absolute pleasure to introduce a researcher actually that I've wanted to meet for a long time, but unfortunately never got the chance. Nussaïbah Raja-Schoob is a soon-to-finish PhD student at the Friedrich Alexander University in Germany, where she's been developing novel computational methods to better understand the impact of environmental change on coral reefs and other ecosystems, I understand. But before her PhD, Nussaïbah read geography at King's College in London. She did a master's in physical geography in Turkey, in Ankara University. And she's also worked in bird conservation in Mauritius. She's also deeply interested in issues around ethics and social justice in paleontology, and has published on topics including sensitive issues around the repatriation of fossils, ethical problems that can be intensified by publication pressure in paleontology. And she's also published on systems that tackle language limitations within the paleontological community. But today she's going to present her research from her PhD. And the title of her talk is Predicting Extinction Risk, Lessons from the Past for Problems for the Future. Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure. And I know you're super busy at this time of your life in a transitional time. And we really appreciate you taking the time to give us a presentation on your research. Please take it over.
Thank you so much for the great introduction. Right, let's see. Okay, so I should hopefully be sharing the right screen. And I'm just going to hide everyone. All right, so hi everyone. As Aaron already mentioned, my name is Nussaïbah, and I hopefully will finish my PhD this year. Let's see how that goes. And what I've been working on is basically understanding reefal ecosystems in the geological past. So when we're talking about reefs, we're not only talking about coral reefs, but also other sort of reefs. But today I'll be mostly talking about coral reefs and maybe the broader context in which the sort of research that I do could be applied. So anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions have caused an increase in global surface temperature since pre-industrial times. This is not news, but this has led to an unprecedented mass coral bleaching events, which combined with growing local pressures have made coral reefs one of the most threatened ecosystems on Earth. And according to a global assessment back in 2008, to determine the conservation status of reef corals, about 33% of reef-building corals are presumed to have elevated extinction risk. So this is based on the assessment by the IUCN, so the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, and a red list of threatened species. That's really long, I always have to write it down. And they are used to quantify the extinction risk of extant species, so that includes reef corals. This comprises 6 categories, non-threatened categories. These include least concern and near threatened. Threatened categories are vulnerable, endangered, and critically endangered. And finally, there are data deficient species for which there are not enough information available to make an assessment. So 90% of reef corals were found to be in the data deficient category when it comes, according to the IUCN. And the initial aim of this study was actually to determine the IUCN threat status of extinction risk for these data deficient corals. Data deficient corals are likely to be overlooked by policymakers, so this limits the progress and success of coral reef conservation. But our initial results showed that these threat status could actually not be trusted, at least in the case of reef corals. I'm not really talking about like everything can't be trusted, but when it comes to coral reefs, corals, we can't really trust it. And the fossil record contains various episodes that can be considered as paleoanalogues of modern climate change. So relating to these extinctions of corals, which we observe in the geological past, can actually help to understand the threats observed by coral species today. And for this, we can use trait data, which I will talk about in a bit. So from the geological record, for those who don't know, reefs have existed for millions of years, and the first reefs appeared around, coral reefs appeared around 485 million years ago, and this displaced the microbial and sponge reefs of the Cambrian. And over the Phanerozoic, there have been many organisms that build reefs, so bryozoans, bivalves, algae. So the geological record of reef building is characterized by these intervals of very limited reef expansion and then these brief episodes of prolific pantropical reef growth, where we see a large number of reefs along the tropical belt, so like today. And from geological data and paleontological data, we also know that there were several instances of ancient reef crises, and these were driven by hypothermal events. And these are times of abrupt climate change happening during greenhouse climate intervals. They are characterized by rapid warming, negative carbon excursion, ocean acidification, and increase of continental erosion. And these also coincided with mass extinction events, for example, the Permian mass extinction, which affected a lot of marine gasifying organisms. So when it comes to Sclerotinian corals, these are the ones that build reefs today. They first appeared in the Triassic after the Permian-Triassic mass extinction, which wiped out all the Paleozoic corals. They established themselves as the dominant reef builders in the late Triassic, and nowadays they represent hubs for the tropical marine biodiversity, providing habitat for more than 1 million species. They are extremely sensitive to stresses such as global warming, and basically this is one of the reasons that they're facing the threats that they are today. So the dominance of corals in tropical reefs and their ability to build these massive complex structures is a consequence of their symbiotic relationship with algae called zooxanthellae. And they contribute up to 90% of corals' nutrition and energy in exchange for protection in inorganic nutrients. There are other groups, the azooxanthellate corals, which that do not rely on these symbionts and have a completely heterotrophic diet. So when I talk about reef corals, I'm only talking about the Z corals, so these zooxanthellate corals. I'm not talking about the ones without any symbiont. So when it comes to corals, we have a problem when it comes to delineating coral species. So in the fossil record, we are mostly restricted to the morphological characteristics, as these are the only characteristics or traits that are preserved. But in the modern ocean, it has increasingly been seen that morphological characteristics are not really trustworthy, for lack of another word. And there is evidence of mismatches between genetics and morphology. And this leads us to the question of how do we actually integrate these fossil and modern data when there is such a mismatch between how we delineate coral species in the fossil record and those in the modern ocean. And this is where trait-based approaches come in. So these are widely used in population and community ecology, so from species to whole ecosystem scales, and life history traits of species can help to predict extinction risks. And reef corals have a range of physiological, morphological, ecological, and reproductive traits that are linked to their various vulnerabilities to climate-driven stresses. And among these morphological traits, as I've just said, they are easily preserved in the fossil record and regularly reported in the literature. So for the last year and a half, we have been compiling the Ancient Reef Traits Database, or the ART database for short, and the database contains trait data on reef building corals that was obtained from the literature. And we have about 20,000 entries, the last time I checked, corresponding to more than 470 coral genera and more than 1,200 species. And these are different traits that are described in the literature, such as the growth form, corallite size. And the first data set was actually released some weeks ago, so you can check it out if you want. When it comes to the paper, we're still making some corrections, but hopefully that should be corrected soon, but it's already available as a PDF and on Zenodo. So Now, trying to actually predict extinction risk, we use analogs from the fossil record, as I said before, and we use the Paleoplastocene as our analog. And we chose this because it consisted of several climate shifts, including warming events that have been considered to be potential analogs for our current warming period. During the Paleoplastocene turnover, around 25% of coral genera went regionally extinct, and 6% went globally extinct. And reef corals living in the Caribbean during this time very similar to reef corals in modern oceans, meaning that coral traits from the Pleistocene and those of contemporary corals are comparable. So therefore, extinctions in the Pleistocene may shed some light on which corals may be vulnerable or resistant to stress during contemporary ocean warming. So we use several traits in this study to predict the extinction risk of modern corals based on data from the fossil record, so from the Pleistocene, and one of them was corallite diameter. And these can be linked to nutrition, where smaller corallites are associated with autotrophy, so they're more dependent on this symbiotic relationship, and the larger ones with heterotrophy. We also use Chronite Integration, and basically it's how close the walls are together or integrated within each other. And the literature says that the communication pathways between highly integrated polyps might facilitate the dissemination of toxic byproducts created, for example, during a bleaching response. We also used the degree of branching, and it's basically how the corals are growing. So some of them tend to be like little blobs, and some look like trees, for example. So it's basically measuring how whether a coral is branching out and how much is it branching out. And this is also strongly linked to linear extension rates, with the branching species growing nearly an order of magnitude faster than massive species, and they tend to be also more vulnerable. We also use budding type, and this is basically the one reproductive trait, and this can affect light transition across the coral skeleton and the light absorption by the coral symbionts. So where do I get my data? For the modern data, there is this coral traits database, and this is what our ART database is based on, and you can download coral traits database from there. We also use data from ORBIS, which is the Ocean Biogeographic Information System, and we use the IUCN data to get the evaluation of the modern extinction risk as for the corals. So we consider 2 categories here, so not the 6 that I showed you before, but basically whether they are threatened or not based on the categorization that I showed already. And then there's the fossil data. So we use primary Cambrian corals, and these were obtained from one of the co-authors who has been looking at the corals in the Cambrian for fossil corals rather for a long time, and these are now integrated within our ancient traits database and in the Paleobiology database as well for fossil occurrences. So how did we do this? I only use this method because I thought it was very fancy and I really wanted to try it, but it turned out to be really good. So we implemented this algorithm called the automatic machine learning using the H2O framework. That's an open source machine learning platform. And it can be used to automate machine learning workflows, including automatic learning and tuning of multiple models. So basically, when using machine learning methods, it's important to tune your models. Think of it as a radio. You're trying to get the right frequency to listen to some music or something. So it's basically the same thing that we're doing by turning different knobs to get the perfect model, or at least the best model possible. And we do this by selecting what we call these hyperparameters, which are these knobs. And I use this because manual tuning usually takes time, and we all know how. I just need to connect my charger. There we go. And I really wanted to test whether we could use these tools because I think even for people who might have the expertise, it's easier to apply such tools than to, spend so much time just to try to get the right model. So what we did was we ran it for a total of 8 hours, and then it just gives you about 60 models that could potentially be one of the candidates for predicting extinction risk. So we chose the best model using one metric, and then using that we predicted extinction risk, and then we compared that to the modern corals to see whether they actually match. Just a quick thing on machine learning for those who are interested. So a lot of people say they tend to be black boxes, and they are, because a lot of the internal mechanisms of machine learning models are very difficult for us humans to understand. So interpretability of a model. So you basically need to know what your model is doing. And there are certain methods that have been used to understand the logic on how the model basically came up with predictions. So for this, I use something called the model agnostic method, which can be applied to any model, and there is no assumption. And the advantages here is like you can actually compare different models and read these methods. So here, what we did was to calculate the variable importance, and this basically shows you the statistical significance of each trait in this situation with respect to its effect on the model. So the higher the number, the more important that trait is for making accurate predictions of extinction risk. And as we see here, corallite diameter, degree of branching, and Chronite integration were all very important. And then body and type and family, which we included for phylogenetic purposes, did not make any contribution to the model. And we can also see how this goes with the predicted extinction risk, and basically whether this is actually following our hypothesis. So it does. So for example, with increasing corallite diameter, you have lower extinction risk. With increasing Chronite integration, you have higher extinction risk. So what did our model actually output? So this here is the geographical distribution of reef corals along the tropical belt, and the estimate by the IUCN. This is not our results of the proportion of corals being at threat. And most of the threatened corals are in the Caribbean and the Coral Triangle near Indonesia. And then this is what our predictions say, and it basically shows that these numbers are highly underestimated almost everywhere, except for the Red Sea, which actually in the IUCN are classified as data deficient. So you can see how much of a difference it is, where everything just turned up red and orange here. So how does the IUCN red list actually fare? So when we applied our model, only 18% of at-risk corals match our model predictions, and 32% of corals that are at low risk at the moment, as per the IUCNs, were predicted to be threatened according to our model. And overall, there was 44% mismatch between the predicted extinction risk by our model and actual extinctions. Almost 50% you could just be throwing a die. There are reasons for this mismatch that we could think of. I mean, our model could be wrong, right? But it could also be the incompleteness of the fossil record, which can lead to the truncation of geographic sizes, for example, or the true time of extinction. But it's unlikely because we didn't use geographic size, but also the sampling of Caribbean corals is particularly good and well resolved. And by using the trade data, we have eliminated problems that we usually encounter with variables such as geographic range. There is also the question of whether the IUCN Red List assessment process correctly identifies threat status for reef corals. There are a number of significant theoretical and practical difficulties in the IUCN assessment, and one fundamental problem is the classification process itself, where it has short boundaries that delineate between each category. So, for example, near threatened species were considered as being non-threatened based on the IUCN classification, but when we look at our data, they are, and across other species as well, the near threatened status is one of the least consistently applied categories among taxonomy groups. There could also be different drivers of extinction. So, you know, whatever happened during the Pleistocene could be fundamentally different from those observed today, even if we think that it is a paleoanalog. So maybe using this as a case study might not be the best approach. But we think that there is an increasing line of evidence that shows that there is this mismatch between the IUCN classification and life history and traits in modern corals. We're not the first people to show this. And the IUCN should actually be incorporating trait data in the classification, especially for the deficient corals, because there is no other information available. Right, so this is what I did quite early on in my PhD, and I was very excited. And I wanted to change the IUCN, or at least those for the reef corals. Obviously, that did not happen. But this hopefully shows that this is one of the ways that we as paleontologists can contribute to discussions to the current climate crisis or conservation crisis by providing such insights from the fossil record. And I really just want to focus on how we could be contributing or from where we could be coming from. So in 2019, we ran a survey where we asked colleagues from the field of paleontology and conservation paleobiology, conservation biology, sorry, on which conservation priority questions could be answerable by paleontologists. So this list of 100 questions came out in 2009. It's basically everything that is related to conservation practice. So, well, I hope you can see this properly because on my screen it's very small. So basically, we could see that paleontologists were actually less positive than people from conservation biology. But so these questions we categorize them based on different categories. So climate change, for example, ecosystem function and services. But there are, we think, so this is based on the opinion of people, that we could contribute a lot, that paleontologists could contribute a lot. And that's, for example, in climate change, ecosystem function and services, management and restoration, marine ecosystem, and species management. And we also compared this to this relevance and effort scores. So there is another paper that came out in 2010, which basically, no, sorry, that was 2018. So it was basically a 10-year review of the 100 questions, and basically whether there has been a lot of effort done and whether people thought this was relevant. And basically, we also rank high on that with what we could potentially be contributing to. So climate change, marine ecosystem are very high, but also the ones that I've talked about before, even if the effort score, so the effort score was actually based on a literature review that they did back in 2018. I don't actually know if they included paleo papers, but they definitely included ecology papers, and you can see that the effort score, so how many reviews, for example, are being written about this particular topic, is that number is quite low. So this is maybe where the emergence of conservation paleobiology could actually be helpful, because it presents a big step towards the better integration of paleontology in conservation science. So conservation paleobiology seeks to apply information from historical records to guide ecosystem conservation, management, and restoration. This is one of the many definitions. So along with many colleagues, we're currently writing a paper on what is conservation paleobiology, and this is what I'll be presenting a little bit. And I think the biggest debate has been actually like how to define it and we've actually dropped the idea of even trying to find a definition. But you can see that there has been an increase in the number of publications of conservation paleobiology papers over the years, and this is a good sign, maybe. And we actually looked at what these papers what topic they are on, and it's about 100 papers in total. We only looked at papers that were indexed in the Web of Science and Scopus, and those that explicitly mentioned conservation paleobiology, and a lot of them were about methods. So we're talking about taxonomy, for example, but also a lot talk about habitat change, climate change again, lots of biodiversity extinction rates. So for example, my paper, or rather the results that I showed before, these would not have been included because I actually never mentioned conservation paleobiology papers, conservation paleobiology in that paper. But that's just showing, like, you know, in what I'm going to be presenting, there is a lot that we're not taking into consideration, or the kind of work that people are doing that is not being considered. So we also ran a survey earlier this year to understand the state of conservation paleobiology from the perspective of this wider scientific community that interacts with the field. And participants, among other things, were asked which taxon group they focused on. And this is, I hope this is the final result, but I think it is. But basically it was half when it comes to terrestrials. So the other here, if I remember correctly, some people mentioned fungi, for example, or lake sediments. But it was 50-50 when it comes to terrestrial, and even so, a lot of people focused on marine invertebrates, which was not surprising, but also on I at least was very surprised that there was so many people focusing on terrestrial systems, invertebrates, but that just showed me how skewed my view of conservation paleobiology already was. And we compared that to the survey, so which taxa actually, to the literature review, sorry, which taxa they actually focused on. And it was about the same in terms of terrestrial versus marine, but you see this dominance of marine invertebrates here, and also when it comes, and also the terrestrial ones when it comes to the vertebrates, and these were mostly mammals, if I remember correctly. So one of the things that we did was to compare that with the IUCN. So this is basically just showing the proportions of taxa that are threatened. So based on so basically the taxa that are in the literature that we looked at, and then whether they are threatened as per the IUCN, or whether they are data deficient. And what we see, for example, when it comes to bivalves, so that's the first first set of bars here. So in the literature, we focus a lot on marine bivalves, but actually more freshwater bivalves are threatened than other ones, and there's a lot more that are data deficient. So, for example, gastropods, it's the same. We focus a lot on marines, but actually maybe we should be focusing more on freshwater ones as well. And when it comes to the others, there's quite low numbers that appears in the literature, but potentially that we could be contributing. So this is just a snapshot, basically, of what this survey and literature review data that we have. And I think it just got too much that we think we could be writing several papers on it. But so, yeah, if anyone wants to join, I think we'd be happy to have you. But yeah, another thing that I did in another review with Wolfgang Kiesling and Jason Smith, Jonathan Smith, sorry, was we looked at the paleontological publications that were included in the IPCC report published in 2014. And what we did was basically which papers were included and maybe try to figure out why. This mostly came up because Wolfgang Kiesling was involved as a lead author in the IPCC, and he had first-hand experience on how things were done, basically. And what we did was we scored papers according to the framing of the paper, so whether it mentioned how it was framed in the abstract and title. So what I think we had, I can't really remember now, but we definitely had like categories on whether we would give it a higher number or not. So the taxonomic scope, so whether it was focusing on one species, whether it was focusing on multiple species, for example, whether a paper reported effect sizes, uncertainty, statistical significance, what they attributed what this paper was looking at to climate change. So, for example, this is caused by climate change, and whether there was a quantitative test for that, and whether it's actually relevant for prediction. So, I think in total, one paper, if you had the perfect score, would be 11. Quite an ugly number, but anyway. Yeah, so what we did, we compared that to some modern papers. So when I talk about modern, so basically things that are from recent data. And we couldn't obviously include all of them, so we only selected a few, and we included all the paleo papers from 2 chapters. These focus on terrestrial and ocean systems. And you can see that modern papers generally scored higher than paleo papers. But then what we did, we actually took a random sample of paleontological papers that mentioned climate change to score them as well. And we did about 100 just to see how these compare to the ones that were included in the IPCC report. And the score that we got is actually lower, which in my opinion was not very surprising, but still just seeing it like that definitely is very striking. So we also compared, so we did these comparisons for the different categories that we had, and in all the categories, the papers that were included in the IPCC report were basically scored higher than the ones from the random sample. And WOS here is the Web of Science. We also look at what scale they were operating, so whether it was like local, regional, global scale analysis, or near time versus deep time. And the IPCC was more interested in global analysis, for example, whereas most paleontological papers tend to be more on the local scale. And obviously, I think to me, this was also not surprising that a lot of the focus was given to near time papers, so that is what ties us into now, whereas a lot of paleontological papers is focused on deep time analysis. So in our survey, we actually asked people what time periods could potentially contribute to conservation paleobiology. And this is what we got, which is almost everything. So the gray here is what people responded. So a lot of people mentioned the near time, but a lot of people said that deep time. We even had a Cambrian or pre-Cambrian one, which was very interesting. But we then compared this to the literature review. So basically the papers that did the analysis on conservation paleobiology, and we just looked at whether, how does it compare of what people are saying and what is actually being done. And what we see here is that a lot of the conservation paleobiology papers tend to focus on the near time and are mostly local to regional scale, with the exceptions of a few. So before I finish, I just want to mention one more thing, which is like, who's actually doing conservation paleobiology work? We know that it originated in the US, well, the term at least originated in the US, but we do see a dominance of people based in the US when it comes to these conservation paleobiology papers. So basically here what we see is how our survey participants and the authors from the literature review. So the people from the US were very well represented when it came to both the survey and the literature review, which again is not surprising. And here you have, for example, Panama. We have people from Panama replying to the survey, and that's the blue bit, but not a lot, or almost nothing appearing in the literature review. European countries are very much well represented as well, and you have Brazil, for example, China, Australia, and I think we have one respondent from India and then one paper. But yeah, just wanted to show you the geographical distribution. And one could argue, that this is, because it's a new field, and obviously because it's mostly people from the US who are working on it, that's why it's happening. But we have to know or understand rather that this is a pattern that is seen within the wider paleo community as well. So within paleontology, you do have a dominance, let's call it, from people from the US and European countries. So these are mostly high income countries. And a lot of the work, so the field studies that is done within paleontology, do not include any local authors. So it's done in a foreign country without any local collaboration. This is what we call crash sheet science. And it's where basically people from richer countries are going to poorer countries to do research without really engaging with the local scientific community or the wider community there. And why am I talking about this? And that's because this is something that I experienced personally when I was a conservation biologist back in Mauritius. But also, this is a pattern that is also seen within the field of ecology and conservation. So here, for example, there's this paper that came out last year, which basically looked at the coral reef scientific community. So, and what they saw was that there were more papers from researchers coming from countries where there were no warm water habitats or coral reefs than in places where there is a concentration of coral reefs. So, for example, Indonesia, and I think here Australia was the only country that made it both in the top countries, and there were only 2 countries that were not high-income countries. So that was Japan and Mexico that made it in the top 10 of countries that contribute to research on coral reefs. So the reason I'm saying this is that any sort of conservation or other scientific work should primarily be done in communication and should benefit the community and region it's being focused on. This parachute science basically creates this dependency on external expertise and does not address local research needs and hinders local research efforts. And when it does come to conservation, yes, we might have the IUCN, we might have these global organizations, but actually the work that is being done is very much locally focused. Yeah, so I'm gonna just end it here. If you want to check out our new paper on the reef traits, you can do so. We also have this website, so art.nap.feu.de. I still have to update it, but yeah. So just gonna stop this now. Thank you everyone for listening. And I've lost my cursor. There we go.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. Absolutely terrific talk and really interesting to hear all the breadth of work that you're doing. So I just put the information about asking questions. You can please, if you'd like to type out a question, please use the Q&A button at the bottom. If you'd like to speak a question yourself, just press the raise hand button, which should appear. And I'll give you access to ask your own question. Do we have any questions? Now's your chance. Okay, we have a question just come in with the Q&A. Let me just open this. Okay, this question is from Samuel Chan. Great talk, Nussaïbah. I was wondering if we know about other stressors for fossil reefs aside from warming, since there are also COTS and disease in modern reefs.
I don't know, because I'm actually not a coral taxonomist or paleontologist, so I don't actually know how this would manifest itself in fossil reefs. So if there's anyone in the room that knows about this, please definitely let us know.
It's a tough one, right? Because you know, effects of predation and disease are sometimes really hard to distinguish in the fossil
Yeah,
record.
especially with preservation as well. It's like, how do you determine whether it's just fully preserved or it's just sick?
Exactly. So I think some of the really interesting work using CT scanning that the group at the Natural History Museum are working on, looking for, you know, bleaching events, cessation of growth in corals, that could be really interesting to quantify the kind of
I
cessation.
don't know if you can actually see bleaching, because if the symbionts themselves are not preserved, and you know, it just loses the color, whether there's anything else that's left from bleaching that we can actually see in the fossil record. But I'm very skeptical when it comes to what's preserved or not. So.
Right, and of course, you know, when you get death, you don't have growth, and without growth, you have no fossil record. So it's kind of tricky. But I think the team at I think Erica Hendy and Ken Johnson are kind of interested in looking at this. They have ideas, and there might be some microstructural approaches as well. But yeah, it's a tricky one, I think. It's a really tricky one, but it gets into the question about different scales and different processes as well, which you touched on, which I think is really important. Any more questions? Okay, Suzette has asked the question. Super talk. I was wondering, what sort of responses did you receive after your great paper on legacy of colonialism in the global distribution of fossil data?
That's a good one. So surprisingly, it was very good. And I think that's because a lot of people who were already very supportive of the sort of work that I and many other people do, you know, they just said how great it was. But then other people who would not necessarily engage with these topics, they did not say anything. So overall, it was great. I think I got 2 or 1 hate mail, but other than that, yeah, it was perfect. Couldn't have asked for better response, to be honest.
I just realized I can let people that have asked questions also speak as well. So I've just done that. If you would like to follow up, Suzette, with anything. Sorry to hear you got hate mail. I hope you framed it.
I have it tagged in my inbox. You know, I think it was maybe a sign of success.
Exactly. Once you get that first hate mail, you know you've made it.
Exactly. I've reached the people who did not want to hear bad things.
We still have time for more questions. Okay. I think that's it. I can't hear any typing. No raised hands. Okay. Well, thank you so much for your talk. It was fantastic. Wish you the best of luck in your new adventures. And I hope your cat gets better soon.
Thank you. Susan asked, when will the Dillon paper come out? I don't actually know. So we was supposed to submit it last week. We got an extension, so we should be submitting it in 2 weeks. And if everything goes well, then it should be in the special issue of Frontiers of Ecology and Evolution. I know that Erin is in the chat, so maybe you know better about the timeline than me.
I think Erin is in the chat.
Yeah.
I'll allow her to talk.
Oh, I can speak. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
We can.
Oh, lovely. Fancy. I've never spoken during a webinar. Fancy this. Yeah, so we're going to be submitting it in about a week or so. And then, yeah, I guess pending what the review process looks like, it should come out, later this year and early next year, something like that. But yeah, in the special edition, Conservation Paleobiology special edition of Frontiers in Ecology and Evolution, as Nussaïbah said.
Thanks, Erin. Do you know
Yeah.
if those papers will be published sequentially as they get accepted, or
I believe so. And there's already, if you look at the website, there's already 3 or 4, I think, that are up, but they've received, I think, as many as 25 submissions. And there's a couple of us stragglers that are still trying to get our papers in. But yeah, it should be quite a large collection of papers, which is really great to see.
Yep.
All right. Well, I'm going to thank you again, because whenever I thank you, another question comes in. This is a surefire way to get more questions.
I mean, people can always email me or contact me if they have other questions. So definitely reach out if you have questions that you don't want to put here publicly in the chat.
Thanks for that. Before we finish, I just want to mention that we have a whole slew of talks lined up for you over the next year, including our next talk, which is going to be given by Dr. Ruth Thurston, who's from the University of Exeter. She'll be giving a presentation on, sounds fascinating, historical approaches to evidence marine ecosystem changes from the Industrial Revolution to the present. So we're really looking forward to Ruth's talk, so don't forget to join us every month. The first Wednesday of every month, we'll be having seminars for the next several years, hopefully. We have lined up at least the next year, so we have some really interesting seminars. If you're interested in giving a seminar, please get in touch with me. I'd happily discuss, ways of doing that, slotting you in and seeing what we can do. We're particularly interested in expanding out to different themes that we haven't yet covered. So, but yeah, just get in touch if you're interested in giving a presentation. Thank you so much again for the wonderful presentation. Thanks for everyone for joining.
For having me.
Yeah, it was great. I'm glad that we finally did this. And good luck. And thanks again for everyone for joining. See you next month.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Aaron, do you want to stop recording?
Good point.